Hi, this is Matt Baker. Every now and then on this channel, I like to take a look at a really old chart rather than one that was designed on a computer. Personally, I find these vintage charts beautiful, and there's often things that we can still learn from them, even if they are out of date. So far, we've looked at Adam's synchronological chart of history, the bird's eye view of the life of Christ, and the histomap of religion by John B. Sparks. Well, today, since the US election is coming up, I thought I'd take a look at this timeline of US political parties. It was published back in 1880 as a fold-out chart in this book called Conspectus of the History of Political Parties and the Federal Government by Walter R. Houghton of Indiana University. Of course, nowadays, US politics is dominated by the Republicans and the Democrats. But this was not always the case. Prior to the emergence of the current parties, there were actually several other older parties, such as the Federalists, the Democratic Republicans, and the Whigs. By taking a look at these older parties, it will help us better understand the origins of the two current parties. So let's start here with the period before the start of George Washington's presidency. Now, since the American colonies were originally British, they initially had the same two political parties that Great Britain had, which were the Tories and the Whigs. Basically, the Tories were those who strongly supported the monarchy, whereas the Whigs were those who wanted to give local representatives more power. During the American Revolution, it was obviously the Whigs, also known as patriots, who dominated, with the loyalist Tories disappearing entirely in 1783, which is when the British finally recognized U.S. independence. Thus, because the U.S. had done away with monarchy altogether, they were left with just a single party, the Whigs. But this situation did not last for long. Although the U.S. was now a republic, there were differences in opinion over how strong the new federal government should be. Those who wanted a strong federal government, with things like a central bank and a standing army, became known as Federalists, whereas those who wanted more state sovereignty were called Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were largely responsible for creating the U.S. Constitution, whereas the Anti-Federalists, who were unhappy with it, were responsible for getting the first 10 amendments added, which collectively are known as the U.S. Bill of Rights. Now, technically, the first president, George Washington, did not belong to either faction. However, most of the members of his administration were definitely Federalists, in particular his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who is considered to be the official founder of the Federalist Party, shown in pink. In contrast, Washington's Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, ended up leading an opposing faction, and this eventually became what we now call the Democratic-Republican Party, shown in green, although at the time they were simply called the Republicans. The reason why historians now call them Democratic Republicans is to distinguish them from the current Republicans, who are not directly related. Okay, so from 1789 to 1824, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were the two main parties. Generally speaking, the Federalists appealed more to the upper classes, who lived in cities and owned businesses, whereas the Democratic Republicans appealed more to farmers and everyday folk. You'll notice that around the year 1800, the pink line and the green line switch places. That's because on this chart, the party that controlled the presidency is always shown on top. So basically, the Federalists were dominant during Washington's tenure and then officially held the presidency under John Adams, who had been Washington's vice president. But then in 1801, the Democratic Republicans took over, with Thomas Jefferson being elected president. Jefferson is credited with strengthening America's democracy by getting more people to vote and for transferring power away from the aristocracy and towards the general public. Although keep in mind that at this point, the general public was limited to white males only. Whereas the Federalists wanted the U.S. to be more like Britain, just without a king, the Democratic Republicans wanted the U.S. to be more like France, which had just experienced the French Revolution. Which brings me to left-wing versus right-wing. Nowadays, these terms are pretty much synonymous with the words liberal and conservative. But originally, they actually had more to do with something else. They originated in France during the French Revolution, when supporters of the king would sit on his right side and the supporters of the revolution would sit on his left side. So at this point, because the US didn't have a king, they didn't really have a right-wing party and a left-wing party. However, over time, the term right-wing has instead come to represent any group that wants to conserve the older traditional ways of doing things, whereas the term left-wing has come to represent those who want to progress forward. Now, the problem with dividing politics into right-wing and left-wing is that it often leads to a situation whereby neither side listens to the other. So you get right-wingers relying only on right-wing sources and left-wingers relying only on left-wing sources. Which is why one of my favorite apps, Ground News, is the perfect sponsor for this video. They combine the world's news from across the political spectrum in one place. So on any given story, you can compare coverage from all angles. For example, a story recently surfaced stating that Kamala Harris is ready to debate, with Donald Trump unsure. On Ground News, we can see over 300 articles were published on this story, with only 15% coming from right-leaning outlets, meaning it could be a blind spot for those readers. Or take, for example, this story exploring who is Ryan Wesley Routh, suspect in second Trump assassination attempt. Ground News published nearly 1,000 articles on the topic, with only 26% coming from left-leaning outlets. Ground News specifically surfaces these kinds of stories on their blind spot feed, helping you have more productive conversations with family and friends on contentious topics. This is why Ground News is so useful. They even have useful charts, like this one that lets you track your own reading habits and whether you might be getting biased information. So, with a major election approaching, Ground News is a tool that we all need. You can check it out now by going to ground.news/charts or by scanning the QR code. Subscribe through my channel this month and you will save 50% off unlimited access to their Vantage plan. All right, back to the timeline of US political parties. Before we move on, I also want to point out this part of the chart down here, where you can see a bunch of little pink and green squares. This shows which party controlled Congress, with the top square representing the Senate and the bottom square representing the House. So that's pretty cool. Moving along the main timeline, we see that Jefferson was followed by James Madison, who was president during the War of 1812. Following that war, the Federalist Party basically fizzled out, resulting in what's called the Era of Good Feeling, in which the US experienced a renewed sense of nationalism and unity. This period coincided with the presidency of James Monroe, and during his 8 years as president, it almost seemed as if party politics were going to become a thing of the past. But that, of course, was wishful thinking. Pretty soon, the Democratic-Republican Party started to fracture into a bunch of different factions, setting the stage for a new set of parties. It started with the election of 1824, in which the only party, the Democratic Republicans, ran 4 different candidates for president. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, as well as the most electoral college votes, but not enough to win a majority. Therefore, the House of Representatives was tasked with holding a contingent election, which was then won by John Quincy Adams, the son of the second president, John Adams. At this point, what was technically one party started to split into 2, with the Adams supporters on one side and the Jackson supporters on the other. Eventually, the Jackson supporters started their own new party called the Democratic Party, shown on this chart in yellow. Take note that this is the same Democratic Party that exists to this day. On the other hand, the Adams supporters became known as the National Republicans, shown on this chart in pink. They lost in 1828, which is when the Democrats elected their very first president, Andrew Jackson. 4 years later, Jackson won again, which led the National Republicans to fall apart. By this point, several smaller third parties had formed, namely the Anti-Masonic Party, which, as the name implies, was mostly focused on criticizing Freemasons, who they saw as elites who wielded too much power, as well as the Nullification Party, which wanted to give states the right to nullify federal laws. Basically, some of the nullifiers combined with the National Republicans as well as the Anti-Masons to form a new Whig party. Thus, for the next little while, America once again had two main parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. You can see here from this very twisty portion that they switched back and forth quite a bit. In fact, this period marked the first time in U.S. history where there were two parties very equally matched. You can see also that this period was quite chaotic, with a bunch of new third parties being formed as well. One of these was the Liberty Party, shown in pink, which wanted the abolition of slavery. It eventually merged with a Democratic faction called the Barn Burners to form the Free Soil Party, shown in dark blue. The main goal of the Free Soil Party was to prevent the extension of slavery into America's newly acquired lands in the West. There was also the Native American Party, shown in purple, but don't be confused by the name. This was not a party made up of American Indians, but rather one made up of white Protestants who were very anti-immigration. Later, they were simply called the American Party, but they were also known as the Know-Nothings because when outsiders asked about their movement, they would simply say, "I know nothing." But then in 1854, the issue of slavery came to a head with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which basically meant that slavery could be extended to those areas. At this point, the entire political landscape reoriented itself around the issue. In the North, Democrats, who were anti-Nebraska, joined with the majority of Whigs, as well as the Free Soil Party, to form a brand new anti-slavery party called the Republican Party, shown in red. This Republican Party is the one that still exists to this day. At the same time in the South, all the pro-slavery Whigs moved to either the Democrats or the American Party. Thus, in 1856, there were three main candidates. However, the Democrats still won, electing James Buchanan, who today is considered to have been the worst president in U.S. history. But then, 4 years later, in 1860, came what would become the most consequential U.S. election of all time. This time, the Democrats split into two camps, with the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats each choosing their own candidate. In addition to this, the new Constitutional Union Party, mostly made up of former American Party members, also fielded a candidate. In the end, all of this vote splitting resulted in a victory for the anti-slavery Republicans, now led by Abraham Lincoln. But of course, it also resulted in the U.S. Civil War, which is why you see the Confederates splitting off from the Democrats here. As you know, the North won that war, and the United States became united once again. From here to the end of this chart, the Republicans remained in power, although technically Johnson was a Democrat, even though he was elected alongside Lincoln as part of the National Union ticket. So for this last part of the chart, there is yet again two parties, this time the Republicans and the Democrats. If we zoom out, we can basically divide the first 100 years of U.S. history into three main parts. From 1792 to 1825, there was the first party system, consisting of the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. Then, from 1828 to 1854, there was the second party system, with the Democrats versus the Whigs. Finally, from 1854 through to the 1890s, there was a third party system, with the Democrats versus the Republicans. Now, before I tell you about the fourth, fifth, and sixth systems, which are not shown on this chart, there are a few more things on here that I'd like to point out. First, take note of this line here, which represents the first time that formerly enslaved Black Americans were able to vote. Well, at least the men. Nowadays, most Black Americans tend to vote for the Democrats, but back then they mostly voted for Republicans, if they voted at all. Then there's this line here, labeled liberal, standing for liberal Republicans, who during the 1872 elections supported the Democratic candidate. Also shown is the temperance movement, which drew from both Republicans and Democrats. It eventually led to the prohibition of alcohol, but that didn't actually happen nationwide until 1920. Finally, there's the labor reform movement, which started to gain traction in the late 1800s. Now, as you can see, this chart ends around the year 1880, which is when it was first published. A later edition extended it to 1892, showing the first post-Civil War Democrat to be elected, Grover Cleveland. But after that, there were sadly no more updates. Thus, in order to bring things up to date and tell you what happened between 1892 and today, I'm going to have to use a more recent chart. There are several out there, such as this timeline, but the one that I like best is this chart, created by Kathleen Kowal. As you can see, it shows the first three party systems, which we've already covered, but then goes on to show the rest as well, starting with the fourth. The fourth party system was a lot like the third, with the Republicans dominating in the North and the Democrats dominating in the South. But the main difference was the increasing focus on progressive issues by both parties. For example, this was the period when women fought for the right to vote, which they were granted nationally in 1920. All of this led up to the Great Realignment of 1932, which marked the transition to the fifth party system. Originally, the Republican Party was the more progressive one, the one that pushed for big government projects, and the one that had its base in the North and in urban centers, whereas the Democratic Party was more conservative, wanted a smaller government, and was more popular in the South and in rural areas. However, starting with the New Deal programs of Franklin Roosevelt, things basically switched and have remained switched to this day. Take note that during the fifth party system, the Democrats held power most of the time. But during the sixth and current system, it's mostly been even. Now, some analysts argue that we are currently entering, or have already entered, a seventh party system, especially considering how much Trumpism has changed the Republican Party. But the jury's still out on that one. A lot will depend on how the current election pans out. Okay, so that was a look at the timeline of US political parties. I'll leave a link to all the charts I've shown in the description. And be sure to subscribe to the channel because I'm currently working on an update of my own timeline of US history chart, which I hope to release sometime next month. Finally, don't forget to check out Ground News for the best coverage of the 2024 election. Thanks for watching.